Well, welcome everyone to the next installment of the GMP Hot Seat. I am very happy to welcome Yash to the hot seat. Yash, we've known each other for, oh man, must been probably over a decade now. I think we first, no, well, maybe around a decade. I think we first met at the PDA FDA data integrity session, as I remember,
Yeah.
as I recall.
Yeah, I think was it pre-COVID or I think it was pre-COVID. I
I
can't
think it was
remember, but
pre-COVID.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
So it's been a
that
while.
it has been a while, and that 2 day workshop was not held for a couple of years, but now it is coming back. So just so everyone knows that the PDA FDA this year will have the add-on session for data integrity, which starts on Wednesday evening and moves into Thursday. It's going to be pretty fun. I'm just going to do a little plug for it, Yash, if you don't mind, before we start.
No, not at
Yeah,
all.
it's gonna be pretty fun. We're gonna try to run it like a gamification, so that like game shows and all case studies and things like that. So if you're interested, that's PDA FDA this week or this year in September. Well, Yash, again, welcome to the hot seat. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. I've got a lot of questions for you, a lot to cover. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So first of all, could you please give us a background, your background, and maybe just expand a little bit on the road to becoming the CEO of QBD Vision? Maybe also what is QBD Vision? What does it do? How did you up in this business of drug development software?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So it's been a bit of a interesting road, I would say. So I'm an optical engineer by training. I did my education, my college degree, my graduate work in optical sciences. I focused on medical and biomedical imaging applications. So if you think about MRI systems, CT, microscopy, anything that is sort of manipulating electromagnetic waves to do imaging and other things I worked in and studied. After I graduated with my PhD from the University of Arizona in 1998, I started a company with two other graduate students to make sort of high-end digital imaging systems for fluorescence microscopy and other biomedical imaging applications. And so that was sort of a bootstrapped company. We didn't really take a lot of investment. We were classic sort of sleeping on the futon with the computer next to the desk and, classic garage startup story that
Yeah,
we
yeah,
went through the dot-com bust and all of the ups and downs of trying to build a company, and then ultimately kind of sold it to a company called Roper Industries 2005. They rolled us into their scientific imaging division, and so that was sort of my first entrepreneurial experience and first sort of successful exit. And then took some time off and traveled the world a bit, and then decided that I didn't want to do optics anymore. And and so I ended up moving to Austin at that point because I was in Arizona. Arrived in Austin in 2009. And in 2010, I got introduced to the technical co-founders of a pharmaceutical company called Xeris Pharmaceuticals and ended up joining them. I didn't know anything about pharma, but they wanted me to come on board to help sort of just operationalize what they were doing. So kind of like, you're looking at a empty plot and you're going, well, I want to build a building here, but I don't know anything about permits or contractors or any of this stuff. So I just need somebody that can help me. I'm sort of an architect, but I need somebody to help me with all these operational pieces of getting started. And I said, well, that I can do because I've done that once.
uh-huh.
And so I came in and helped, sort of do that, help build that operational foundation, help raise money, And so the first 4 years was a lot of that as our initial programs got started. And then my last 2 years, I just kind of started focusing on the process development and scale up activities, so just kind of overseeing those because we were moving from phase two to phase three. And, now thinking about like, what CDMO we were going to use and what registration batches we were going to make and the size of these things and so on and so forth. And so as I started to get involved, I was doing a lot of reading and I said, look, it seems like there's a lot of information we need to be kind of managing here. And pulling together. I was like, what's the software platform? I was asking our consultants that people use to pull all this information together. And I just kind of chuckled like you're chuckling. And they're like, well, there isn't anything, right? And I said, what do you mean there isn't anything? And they said, no, well, people just use Excel or Word and they'll kind of put it together in documents and they get approved and they go into a QMS. And that's kind of how we manage information. And I thought, well, wow, that's really challenging because, I'm sitting in meetings and we're doing risk assessments and, I've got quality people asking me like, what is the justification for these specifications and blah, blah. And I was like, I don't know, let's go find out, right? So we're having to do what everybody else does, right? Which is go look in reports and dig for things here and there. And it just I found it, fascinating that this was how an industry that did such exquisite science was just managing, like operationally that this is how they were operating, right? And so when I so a couple fast forward a couple of years, a new team came in to take Xeris Pharmaceuticals public. And so that's a public company today. That program that actually we were working on is now an approved product. It's the
Nice.
Gvoke HypoPen for severe hypoglycemia. Um, and um, and so I then took some more time off, and I thought, I think the next thing I want to do is see if I can solve this problem, right?
Hmm.
But I also thought, well, it's not. First of all, people were asking me, why hasn't somebody done this before? And I said, I don't know why, but as I started to get into it, I figured out why. It's because it's a really complicated problem to solve, right? People
Mm,
kind of, I think they want to go solve it, and then what they do is they just build another ELN, right? Or they want to go solve it, and they go, well, they start somewhere, they go, oh, it ends up being another LIMS, or it ends up being another QMS, right? Just a better mousetrap, if you will. and
so like paper on
and
glass type of
yeah,
solutions.
exactly, right. So they look at a business process and they go, well, we're just going to replicate this business process in some digital form, and they just kind of repeat that, right?
Mm.
And as I talking to people more recently, I'm like, you can think about it like if you think about all of the CMC process development, all the work that goes on that side of the house, you think of it like a big pizza, and you got a bunch of slices, and people say, well, I'm just going to try to solve the one problem in one slice,
Hmm.
right? And then you go, that's great, but that doesn't help the person at the other slices because they don't know what's going on over here. You still have to connect them somehow. And so we came to the problem with the idea that we want to kind of tackle the whole pizza, right? Not just one slice. Because if you tackle the whole pizza, now you're actually starting to get to the root of the problem, which is how do the risk people talk to the process people, and how do the QC people understand what the product specifications are, and how do you intertwine all this information so you have the right operational visibility that you need to make good decisions and not be constantly playing whack-a-mole with your process where you're like, oh, this problem happened, now let's fix you. So you end up just treating a lot of symptoms in things that happen operationally instead of thinking about it foundationally, about like how should you build a proper foundation so that you get quality designed into the product, not tested into the product, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This is a timely I think our session is on QBD is a timely session because, I was giving a talk at PDA week this on was it Wednesday? Yeah. And one of my slides was on the current state of affairs regarding CRLs, right? I mean, in 2015, if we look back, FDA issued CRLs, which is it's like a withhold decision for
Right.
temporarily or permanently on a pre-approval or pre-license inspection. And that rate was about 5%, right? And fast forward to today, what we've got is about 20% CR rate of CRLs, right? And anecdotal evidence that was from 2025 and going back about 4 years, averaging around 20%. I can tell you that anecdotal evidence from this year is going to be even higher, right? We don't have that data yet, but the way it's trending and it just anecdotally, I can see that this is not getting better, right? And Sieber gave a presentation recently where they talked about, what are the root causes for these CRLs? Because if we don't acknowledge that and fix that, then we're going to be in trouble. And they showed this like a graph of the different categories of failures, and the number one was failure to maintain QA oversight, right? So basically managing risk. that's really QA's job. One is to obviously approve a batch, make sure there's no open deviations, those checklist type of activities. But the other thing is that QA is tasked with doing is managing the risk. The problem is when regulators show up for these pre-license or pre-approval inspections, they're finding that QA doesn't actually know where the risks are. They're watching aseptic filling and they're seeing these things, or they're, you know, not managing how the recipes are like where the what is the significance of these alarms, for example, that are experienced during production. None of that knowledge is getting transferred to these proposed commercial operations. So I wanted to follow up on just ask what so you could say that a lot of this stuff is data integrity or data reliability related, right? And so I wanted to ask you on the next question, like what is QBD and how does it solve this problem of efficiency, like you mentioned, but also reliability? We can maybe start from a high level. And what are the main concepts that one should know about ICHQ8 or quality by design to start off this discussion?
Yeah, so it's a great question. When we started the company, I named it QBD Vision because I thought that would be obvious to people what we're doing, right? And
Mhm.
the funny thing is that it is obvious to many people, but a lot of people would say, well, we're not doing QBD, or we are not doing it until late. We're too early right now to do QBD, right? So I think the first thing is that people fundamentally don't understand what QBD is,
Yeah.
right? And a
Okay.
lot of them think that it is a characterization activity. It's an activity you do in characterization to actually characterize the design space, and that's it. And and that's something that happens later. So if you're earlier stage, well, we're not worried about that, and so we're not talking about that right now. And I think that is a fundamental misunderstanding, right, of actually what's supposed to be happening. And what they don't really understand is that QBD is actually a product design philosophy, right? That's supposed to span the life cycle of development, right? It's a holistic approach to how you're doing this. And every industry that makes a product should be operating under a product design philosophy, right? Which usually has a number of sort of components to it. And it evolves as you go from development into manufacturing and ultimately sort of commercial manufacturing, right? So in the world of a lot of manufacturing industries, quality by design will be how you figure out how you're going to design and make your product. And then as you start to scale it, you kind of go into lean manufacturing, which tries to make it more like reduce the or increase the throughput and reduce waste. And then you get into Six Sigma, which is like, okay, I have a stable process. Now, how do I monitor it? How do I make it even better? Right. And that's what you should be doing. Right. But they don't really think of it that way. Um, and so if you think about it being a product design philosophy, those elements tend to be things like, well, minimalism. So if you think about a minimalist approach, that's what I consider scientific and risk-based, right?
Hmm.
Which are the terms you see in QA, right? The reason you do risk-based assessment is because you can't test everything. It's not possible, right? So you need to think about what are the areas where you should focus, right? And where are your areas of greatest risk, and where you have to focus your control, right? So to me, scientific and risk-based is actually your minimalist approach, which is a key element of good product design, right? When you make things too complex, that means you're really not designing things properly, right? So
Yeah.
the next thing is human-centered and empathetic design, right? Well, that's starting with the patient in mind. That is a key element of what we do or supposed to do in the pharma industry. Probably the number one um, uh, piece of quality by design is starting with the end in mind, which really reflects human-centered and empathetic design, which again is what good product design does, right? So if you think about the iPhone, right,
Humans.
that was a great human-centered, empathetic design as opposed to whatever other things that you had before that never really took off like the iPhone did, right? Form and function the same way, right? People kind of like, oh, we got to do human factors, I hate doing human factors. Like, wait a minute though, human factors matters, right? If somebody can't deliver the drug, this was really important for us at Xeris because it was a combination product. It's designed to be done in an emergency setting. The existing product was a reconstitution product that nobody could figure out in an emergency. So
Mm,
terrible human factors. And we came in and basically said, well, we're going to replace this with a shelf-stable auto-injector. So nobody has to mix anything. You just pull the cap and inject it. So, a kid could almost do it, right? If they needed to. And so I think we missed this concept for some reason in the pharmaceutical world where we don't think about a drug as actually a product design that you have to have a philosophy around. And quality by design is what governs that in our world.
I really like that. Thanks. You mentioned this term. So another reason why we're talking about this is because in 2023, FDA revised their pre-approval compliance program. If you're not aware of FDA's compliance programs, take a look at them. They're the ones that are relevant to your company. These are all on the internet. They're called CPGMs, right? And the one that's relevant to pre-approval inspections is 46.832. That one, it was revised in 2023. It had always, the pre-approval inspection program was really solidified after the generic drug scandal from 1984 to 1989. And in the aftermath of that, it had really remained almost the same up until a couple of 2 years ago, right? And they added a fourth objective. So there was always three objectives to a pre-approval inspection program, right? GMP
Right?
readiness, conformance to application, and data integrity. But in
Yep.
2023, they added a fourth objective called management's commitment to quality in pharmaceutical development, right?
Yes, I remember this. I remember this. Yes.
Yeah. They say in the compliance program, these aren't necessarily going to be listed on a 43 as deficiencies, anything found under this objective four, but the investigators are supposed to log these incidents within the report so that the folks reviewing the application can understand what is the maturity what is the quality maturity level in pharmaceutical development? Because if it's low, I can't actually maybe trust some of the data that's in this BLA or NDA, or maybe I need to do further evaluation to identify if there's unusual patterns in this data or something. It's a signal for the reviewers to figure out how much reliability can we have in this data, because the data that maybe comes inside of a BLA could probably fill up my living room if you printed it all out, right? And
Right.
so what does like so if you were an investigator looking at and tasked with fulfilling that objective four, what would you look for during that pre-approval inspection for management's commitment to quality in pharmaceutical development?
So, well, again, thinking about quality by design, I'd say, okay, show me your QTPP. I want to see your CQAs, right? And so, I take a look at the CQAs and go, okay, and I try to look at the justifications for criticality and so forth. And then I would say, okay, show me some of the CPPs show me your CPPs that impact this CQA right here,
Hmm.
right? And I imagine what would happen is there's the war room somewhere, right, where a bunch of people are sitting with all their information, and somebody would run over to the war room and say, "Hey, can you give us reports or some table or whatever that shows how these CPPs impact the CQA?" Right? So they come running back and they say, "Okay, here you go. Right?
Yeah.
Here's the CPPs that are linked to the CQA." Right? And then I'd say, "Okay, show me your process capability data that confirms that you have things under control and that you have your CQAs under control, and I also want to see what studies you did to show that these ranges of CPPs that you have here, whatever your proven acceptable range matches, matches up to um, what your specification is, and that these CQA is in control, right? Because to me, I feel like the most important thing you're trying to figure out is product quality, right? And one of the questions that I always have is people seem to get focused on quality compliance in terms of, well, do you have kappas? How fast are you resolving the kappas? So on and so forth. That seems to be quality compliance and not quality management or not product quality management. And I feel like maybe I'm wrong about this, but I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect between what QMSs have become versus what they're really supposed to be driving. Because if QMS was really effective, why are there so many drug shortages related to product quality?
Hmm. 62%. Yep.
Right. Why? Why are they so many if QMS is so good at what it's supposed to be doing? And I think it's because it's drifted away from product quality management to quality compliance management, right? And so you don't have a lot of outstanding kappas. Okay, great, but did the kappas actually resolve the problem,
Mm.
right? And did they actually resolve it in a way that was a symptomatic resolution, or did you actually foundationally change a behavior that so that the symptom won't show up anymore, right? And that to me is where I would be focusing. And that's what we were thinking about when we built QBD Vision is that we want to go back, get the industry back to driving product quality management, right? And getting rid of this problem of shortages because you don't have good control over your product quality.
So, yeah, thanks for that. You mentioned in the previous on the previous point, this issue of human-centered design, and you mentioned it in the context of the patient in the case of the auto-injector, I believe it is that you were
Right.
working on. Yeah. But you sort of hinted on it again in this next segment where you talked about, are you getting to the root causes of and immediately what came to mind to me was, what are a lot of these, 62% of drug shortages due to? The FDA says the manufacturing and quality issues, right? So really, those are things that happen at the site. And if
Right.
you dig down next level, you're going to find a lot of those are due to, human errors, really. I mean, not necessarily malicious intent, but like just
Right.
errors, rationalizing bad behavior, like things like that. How does QBD and the principles of Q8, if you're a site out there struggling with high level of human related issues, like probably most of the folks on the line here, like how does QBD? I know everyone on the line probably is very familiar with Q9 and Q10. Well, mostly Q9 probably, right? Where we're talking about quality risk management, maybe a little bit in Q10 where we talk about risk management and knowledge management. But where does Q8 fit into this puzzle and say that to address this human centered design issue? And I'm talking about like workflow designs in the production now or in QC.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I'm going to give an example so in Q8, right, you've got the QTPP, which is mentioned pretty prominently throughout, right? And so I remember, I've talked to a variety of people about the QTPP, and um, a lot of times I find that that's something that's a document that's kind of written after the fact to just kind of collate all of the information in people's heads. I've talked to CDMOs where they've said, "Oh yeah, we have companies that come to us and they're like, oh yeah, we're ready to run our registration batches," and they go, "Well, where's your QTPP?" And they go, "What are you talking about?" They go, the QTPP." Like, yeah, we don't have that. They're like, "Well, you're not ready to run your registration batches yet, then,
What is a
right?"
QTPP?
The quality target product profile,
Okay. Can you
right? So that's
elaborate a little bit on that one?
oh, sorry. So that
Yeah.
is a document that or a concept that's described in Q8 where you are supposed to um, basically define what are the quality attributes of the product, right? Based on and then you risk assess them. Well, the risk assessment actually isn't in the Q8 discussion, right? That comes in through Q9. But
Yeah.
ultimately, you're supposed to figure out those attributes that impact patient safety and efficacy. You're supposed to list those, which ones are going to be the highest risk, and then you start to then discuss how you control those. And that's really the whole train that starts around the control strategy development, right? Because that's ultimately what you're doing is you're trying to explain how are you going to manage and control the CQAs of your product to ensure product quality, which means you get the right safety and efficacy profile,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So, so if you think about that, right, people they don't a lot of times fundamentally use that as the basis of design for the product, even though that's what's asked for in QA, right? The words are there. This is supposed to be your basis for design of the product to
Okay.
ensure, right? Right. And that this is the idea of a product design philosophy. QA is giving that to you. It's telling you what the agencies want to see. And any any good product development company will have a user requirements document. And that's effectively what the QTPP is saying. Like, this is what we need. The TPP and the QTPP together are saying this is what the product needs to do for the user, which is the patient,
Okay.
right? This is what's important. Now, um, in the absence of a platform like ours, the conversation becomes very disconnected around,
Hmm.
okay, well, here's the you've got a product maybe manager who says, okay, these are the things that we need that's important for a monoclonal antibody, for example, like aggregation or sterility or whatever, right? And then the QC person comes in and says, okay, well, for sterility, we use this USP method. And so they bring in and this is where do you put all that information together, right? And then how are you getting the clinical teams and the toxicology teams and other teams involved in the conversation so that somebody says, well, aggregation is a risk because, you know, by the way, having aggregate proteins can be toxic to the patient. The toxicology people say that's what's going to happen, right? So we have watched people use our platform as a way to make conversation happen between the functional groups in a way that creates a much more robust QTPP because you actually sat down in a meeting and you had the clinical folks in and you had the toxicology folks in and you had the QC folks in and you had the process people in and they're all in there together understanding that this is what's good for the patient. And in the absence of having a platform that brings all that information together, people do that, they have those conversations separately and they kind of get a little bit disconnected. Or they don't even do them. And that's when you have a situation where the company shows up. Generally, these are smaller companies. It's not like a major pharma is going to do that. But a smaller company is going to show up and go, oh, you mean we need to have a QTPP before we run registration batches? Well, yes, yes, you do. And, so yeah.
I'm always thinking things through it like an inspector or investigator lens. And you mentioned like this QTPP again, and which is your control, but really the fundamental document that defines the parameters that are involved in manufacturing that ensure safety and efficacy, right?
Efficacy, yes.
Um, I'm just thinking about alarms, for example. I can go out to a commercial site now and they may not have categorized the different alarms that they may experience during, I don't know, crystallization or during filling or whatever it is. And I'm just thinking, shouldn't they, when they develop their strategy for like audit trail review or review by exception or whatever it is in commercial production, shouldn't they be linking all that data back to the QTPP?
Yes, exactly. And even Q8 asks for that. It says you should be tracing your critical process parameters to your critical quality attributes, right? And
Mhm.
so that is the first stage of linking, and then the next stage is, okay, well, we're going to do a bunch of characterization work around our process to come up with a proven acceptable range and a normal operating range. And then your alarms are based on those ranges, right? To determine, where you set off an alarm. But ultimately, if an alarm happens, somebody should be able to understand, oh, if this is an alarm, it turns out this is actually maybe a key parameter that affects yield, but it's not a critical process parameter that impacts patient safety and efficacy, right? But they have no way of knowing that a lot of times.
Yeah.
They just know that alarm's going off on something and they're going to record it. But nobody it takes some time to figure out what to do about it. And that time is, you know, digging through reports and trying to find out, well, what were we measuring here and how does this impact a CPP? and it also could be an indirect relationship where, you're tracking, say, a pH, right? But what that's really impacting is an attribute of an intermediate, and how does that intermediate impact the final product and the CQA? So, when all this stuff is in documents, there's really no way to trace that, and that was one of the key things we were trying to address when we were thinking about QED vision was how do you convert how do you get away from documents and think about the individual pieces of information as nodes and link them? So you almost can make knowledge graphs that you've seen our risk map,
Mm.
right? That shows you, hey, if I have a pH here, I can see quickly all the things that impacts downstream because they're linked. Not only are they linked, they're linked by risk. So the other thing is integrating risk into that conversation, which sits separately right now from a lot of times the physical connections, between things. The risk conversation is happening somewhere else, and they merged at some point, but maybe they do, maybe they don't. And if they do, you don't know how well they're being merged.
Yeah, you're giving me all kinds of ideas for inspections. Thanks. Like, because if you think about the PICS guidance on, so I'm talking about a pre-approval or maybe a surveillance inspection, and the PICS guidance is very clear about what is a critical observation. That would be classified for us in the U.S. We would classify that as a OAI result, right? Official action indicated, and it's defined as except for data integrity, so that's one category that's automatically OAI. But like if you misrepresent data. But the other category is there's a situation where we have significant risk to cause harm to human or food producing animal, right? So in this case, human. And it's like what I would want to do on my next inspection is look at their alarm strategy. These are critical, these are medium criticality, these are we trend
Right.
these, or these ones we don't review at all unless we have an incident. Generally, there's four categories that you can put alarms into. And I'm just thinking like I would try to find one that isn't necessarily located on their critical list that is linked to the QTPP, and then demonstrate that way via your own science that
Right.
you are not under a state of control.
That's right.
Hmm.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. It's a little inspection strategy there. I can build into my toolbox. Okay. Yeah, so I want to get on to a next question and just talk about how like the approach to have you seen a change in industry over the past 10 years? Are you think folks are embracing these principles to a greater degree or maybe even lesser degree? What in your experience?
Well, I think the trends are in the right direction. I still don't see people talking about quality by design as a product design philosophy for pharma or biotech, right? They're
Hmm.
not, they're not, they still don't recognize that it's foundational. Whether you want to call it quality by design or something else, any company that's making a product should have a product design philosophy underlying it, right? And I don't see that kind of um, mental model in people's heads, right? They still think very kind of parochially about, well, I'm in QA and I need this, and I'm in QC and I need this, and I'm an MSAT person and I need this, right? And so um, they kind of think about their slice of the pizza and they don't think about the whole pizza, right? And
Yeah.
so now when we that's changing because in order to there are obviously a lot of pressures on the industry now from a pricing perspective, from just sort of supply chain perspective, so on and so forth, that they have to think about becoming more efficient operationally, right? So now you're starting to see these thought processes emerge around, okay, well, we want to be able to reduce our overall cycle times. One of the areas where we have extended cycle times is tech transfer. Can we use a digital approach to make tech transfer faster and better, right? And so, those are the kind of things that we're starting to see emerge, but they're still not really thinking about it from a QBD perspective, right? Which I think what our approach was is just kind of thinking about how you get people to do things you want them to do psychologically. You can't just tell them to do it, right? You can't
Yeah.
just come in and say, "Hey, Peter, you should do this,"
Yeah.
and you're going to go,
Thanks,
"Well, who
thanks
are
for
you
your
to tell me?"
opinion.
Yeah,
But
right, exactly, right. And you don't, and so our approach instead was to design a platform whereby when you use it, it just drives the correct behaviors, whether people realize it or not, right?
mm,
So as an example, if you want to create traceability, say from a process parameter to a quality attribute, we make you do it by risk. So we make you answer the questions. What is the risk of this parameter to this quality attribute by the layers of risk that are sort of required by ISO 14971, right? So it starts with impact or criticality. However, the device world sort of has different terminology than the drug world, but if criticality is sort of this combination of impact or severity and your understanding of the severity, right? Like is do you or the impact? Do you understand this impact because you run clinical studies and you have actual data, or do you understand is this impact based on another program that was similar, or is this impact just based on literature research that you've done, right?
mm.
So,
So it
right,
forces you
so
to answer the questions.
it forces you to answer these questions, right? And so some people say, well, we don't want to do that. We go, well, look, we have a not assessed layer, but you're going to see somebody pulls that map up, they're going to see that these links have not been assessed,
Hmm.
right? And somebody's going to ask the question, well, why haven't they been assessed, right? And so you drive the behavior through the usage, the way the software is constructed, and it makes you do things. And I think that is working quite well because sometimes people will say, well, right now we just want to build our traceability, but we don't know anything about the risk. We're like, okay, fine, do that. But at some point you're going to have to answer the question. You're not going to be able to ignore it forever. And then you start answering the questions and you build the risk framework that way. So I think I think we are driving people towards a better product design approach um, by just presenting the software in a way that they go, oh yeah, I know I need to do this and this, but they're not realizing that it's kind of driving the behavior that's going to make them thinking about it from a product design perspective.
Yeah, so you're talking about a structured approach to QBD.
That's
Yep.
right.
With
That's
a
right.
bunch of forcing functions through software design.
That's right. Right.
Nice.
Hey, by the way, you can't propose this thing for approval unless you have justification fields in here.
Hmm.
People hate that. They're like, no, no, we don't want that. We're like, yeah, but you have to have a justification. Somebody's going to reject your proposal at some point because you don't have any justifications in here. So
Yeah.
you might as well, you know, they're like, well, we don't know the justification. I'm like, okay, then write that for now. Just write that. We don't know right now, right?
Uh-huh.
We're going to figure it out later, right? But you can't just leave it blank.
You mentioned there that, and I'm hearing the same thing from my side. Like a lot of companies are, because of cost constraint, pressure, wherever that pressure is coming from, to reduce the timeline from, initial drug discovery to commercialization, right? By
Right,
1 year, 2 years, 3 years, it varies by company. Um,
right,
Now, obviously, this is going to be achieved through digitalization and some of the stuff that we've been talking about. But if you're like a professional, maybe young professional or any professional really on the line today, and you're thinking about your company is probably also going to ask you to reduce the time it takes you to do something that you used to do in 4 months, now it's going to be 3 months or 2 months. So if you were that person in your experience, now this is just a general question now. What would you focus on to prepare yourself like for the future of this industry based on these pressures, but other things maybe as well?
um, I'm always a person that tries to start with the idea of what am I trying to accomplish, right? Like it's an outcome-based approach, right? It's like, well, if my job is X, what does that mean? Like what do my bosses or my organization, care about, right? And And it's not to say that that's right. You just start there, right? Because they might say, well, we want you to whatever. I don't know if you're seeing a certain number of of out of specifications, and like we want you to reduce some metric, make it
Yeah.
better over time, right?
Yeah.
Continuous improvement.
Yeah.
And and you say, okay, that's fine. But the first question I'd ask is, well, are we tracking the right thing? Like, what is it that we're actually trying to do, right? It's not
Mm,
get this number lowered. It's, well, what does this number actually, what does it actually impact? Because one of the things I find all the time is that people say, well, we're doing X and we're measuring it as Y. And then you ask the question, well, is Y the right measure for X? Right? We're seeing this in the AI world, right? We're deploying AI tools, and one of the things that I recognized was that with our structured approach, we kind of have this luxury of being able to build a trust framework around the AI tools that we're developing. So we can actually come back and quote, well, here's how accurate this was, and here's what our precision, here's what our repeatability, so on and so forth. So that somebody goes, okay, well, if I'm telling you, well, look, this is 50% accurate, you're gonna say, okay, well, that tells me how much additional oversight I need to have versus if it's 80 or 90% accurate, right? And and no system is 100% accurate, so you always have to consider that, right? And so, but it's important to do that. And as we're thinking about these measures, I'm always asking the question, well, are we measuring accuracy the right way? Right? Are we for what we're trying to do? Right? So I think it's always, as an engineer, as a scientist, I think it's always really important to ask the question, do you have the right outcome for what you're, do you have the right technical outcome for what the business outcome is that you're really trying to achieve? And do you have the right measure for that technical outcome?
hmm
Because if you don't have the right measure, you're never going to get, the whole thing is broken, right?
hmm
And which is also why I find it interesting that QC doesn't get the attention it should in the farm from the other business sides of the business, because that to me is one of the most important parts of the organization, right? If you can't accurately measure what you're trying to measure, then you're nowhere, you're lost, right?
Yeah. As a QC person, I can confirm QC does not get the attention that they deserve.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
you
everybody's focused on discovery and clinical, and then they get to CMC, and then they get to the C part of CMC at the end,
uh-huh,
which is bizarre, right? But that's
uh-huh.
that's kind of what it seems like. Now it's really interesting. We are seeing a lot of we are seeing a lot of movement towards ICHQ 14,
Okay.
right? There's a lot of
Can you
now,
explain that
int
that guidance document?
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So ICHQ 14 is the guidance document around life cycle management for analytical methods, right? And so I think this came out about 3, 4 years ago, if I am correct. And so it came out. So it usually takes time for it to get some traction, but we have always looked at that and said, one day people are going to come to us about this, because an analytical method is really not any different than a manufacturing process architecturally, right? You
Mm,
kind of have chunks of you have unit operations, if you will. You have
yep.
steps within those. You have materials. You have equipment. All the same sort of structural definition of a manufacturing process applies to an analytical method, right? And so if you want to start managing the life cycle of an analytical method, you just do it the same way that you're doing it for a manufacturing process. And people have that light has gone on for a lot of people. And so we are seeing a ton of interest in our platform for managing methods, because then you use the same motions to transfer the method as you do to transfer manufacturing process, right? You can
That is
use those
so
same workflows.
that is so interesting that you bring that up, the parallelism, so to speak, between a manufacturing workflow and a workflow in QC. And it's
Yeah,
interesting because in my mind, I immediately thought, well, why don't they develop like a QTPP for each analytical method, right?
right. And it's ATP. That's what they call it. They call it an ATP in the ICHQ 14 document. It's an
Mhm.
analytical target profile which is the
Yep.
parallel document. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, because we see workflows in QC. The problem is we treat method validation as process validation. It's not, though, really. Method validation, well, it's related to process validation, but it's basically like, can you achieve repeatability and linearity and all these things, right?
Right,
Okay, it's
right.
validated. But that's such a small sample size, like three runs or 3 runs or whatever, done by an expert in that area. Is that going to translate well to commercial production where the timelines are much shorter, the pressure is a lot higher? They're not thinking about the human, what did you say, human-centered design in the
Of the
way that
method.
these workflows are coming. So when you see a high number of invalidated OSs, it's an immediate trigger to say, yeah, you've got to think about validation in a different way, like from
Yes,
a QBD approach. And
that's right.
here's where
Well, I mean,
Q14
it's an
steps in, I
intent. So I
think.
think that's what Q14 is saying,
Yeah.
is it's saying that is your method appropriate for the intended use, right? Which is that there's a CQA that you're trying to
Yes.
measure, and is it appropriate for that given what your range of the CQA might be, and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
I find it really fascinating, because this gets into the risk assessment side of things. Detectability is a layer in risk assessment, but it actually isn't about risk. It's about the control of residual risk, right? Risk is just uh, capability, a criticality, and occurrence, right? That's how
Yep.
ICH 14 or ISO 14971 basically defines it.
Yep.
Detectability is not defined in ISO
No.
14971 because it's after the fact. It's you've already figured out what your risk is, and now you're trying to figure out how do I control my residual risk, right? How do I manage that? That's what detectability is. And then what's interesting is that they only define detectability in terms of when will I catch the problem in the process,
Mm.
right? As an engineer, I'm like, well, but is the resolution of your method tight small enough to actually measure what you want to measure in the in the CQA, for example. So if you're measuring purity, for example, right, and you have this peak in the in your chromatogram, right? If you say you're trying to measure purity from let's say it's got to be 99.5% to 99.6%, really tight, right? For some reason, right?
Yeah.
Is the resolution of your method tight enough that it's at least 0.05%? Because you only have 0.1% range. It's got to be at least 0.05%, right? To measure within that range. And
Hmm.
I never see that in the case studies that are out there on detectability. I never see the resolution of the method as a factor in determining detectability.
Mm.
In every other industry, you see that. You see the resolution of the tests, and it tells you, is that test good enough to measure whatever variation you're trying to measure.
Yeah. Like
And
if
I
you're
never
saying
see
this
that.
dilution step is super critical, and you're saying, well, we'll detect it in the final result, but then is your resolution actually in that
Yeah,
risk
yeah,
assessment is, or even assessment, if you just want to call it an assessment, you don't even have to call it a risk assessment. That
right, right.
evaluation is generally not done. We treat quality in this industry as pass or fail. If it
Fail,
passes,
right,
it's good. If it fails, it's bad. You're
right.
always going to hear me referencing the works publications by W. Edwards Deming on this matter. He told us this back starting in the 1950s up until he died in 1991, right?
Right.
That this is not the way we think about quality. We think about quality as variability in the
Ability,
workflow.
right,
Yes.
right,
And
right.
we just,
Absolutely.
this is I think what QBD sort of forces us to do, right? Is to think
Right.
about quality. I can use these two terms like interchangeably, risk and variability. They're like, to me,
Yes,
those are the same, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. Yep.
great. Well, I want to move on to some more different category of questions in our remaining few minutes here. You know, like, should we be afraid of AI?
Well, I mean, look, I would say no.
I
I
don't mean
think
like the end of the world. I mean like for
no, no,
within
I
our
know.
industry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, I don't think so. I think um there's a lot of just in the world in general around AI. I think there's a lot of sort of misapplication of the technologies because first of all, you have to segment the different parts of AI, right? Everybody kind of lumps it together as one big, as one sort of monolithic thing, and it isn't, right? So, and most of what they're referring to when they say that is the LLM Gen AI side of stuff,
Yeah.
right? So you have that side of it. Then you also have machine learning, right? And now you have these new models called world models that are coming out that are going to be a combination of text and video and audio, right? So I mean, AI has a lot of different sort of segments to it. I think the machine learning side of AI is very powerful for the pharma industry, and people need to embrace that. You're already seeing it with digital twins,
Yeah.
right? So we don't do digital twins, but we are partnering with digital twin companies because they need digital process definitions. Well, guess where they can get that from? From us, right? And then
Mm.
after they run their optimizations, they need to put all that new information in some sort of source of truth that again is digital so they can find it again and use it, right? So we kind of work with them where we can supply a digital definition, they do their optimizations, they return the optimized definition back to us, process back to us, right? And there's a lot of nice data governance and data integrity in all that process, and it works really well. And what you end up then getting is a situation where you can have really strong database justifications for your risk assessments, right? Especially on the occurrence in the occurrence layer of risk. So much of occurrence risk assessment is, to me, still very subjective when it doesn't have to be, right? It can be a lot more data driven, and I think these machine learning AI models are going to be the genesis of much better and much stronger data justification for occurrence risk, which then tells you the overall risk, right? So you as an inspector over time, as these, you should be able to say, well, where's all your data for this occurrence risk justification? If they tell you, well, we just ran 3 batches, I mean, 10 years from now, that's going to be unacceptable,
Mm.
right? Because you're going to be able to say, well, wait a minute, why didn't you run a simulation, right?
Mm.
And and why didn't you simulate, because we're seeing data now where you can take a say a screening study or even a characterization study that you had to run 50 DOE experiments to characterize all the variability
Mm.
across your or whatever variables you were testing. They're able to take that down now with AI to like 10, not just like 10 simulated experiments, right? Not actually having to run all the physical stuff,
Oh,
right?
wow.
So you cut down by 75 to 80% the amount of work you have to do to start building your models, right? And they're much more robust because they can handle multivariate scenarios, whereas DOEs kind of really struggle with that, right? So I think that's an example where people should be embracing machine learning and AI approaches because I think you're going to get much more robust um, uh, evaluation and analysis, and it'll lower the cost enough that people will go do it now, as opposed to before saying, you know what, DOEs are too expensive. We're just going to
Yeah.
do some OFAT stuff and hope for the best, right?
Mm.
And uh, and so I think that is an area that people should embrace and not be worried about. I think on the LLM side, people shouldn't be afraid of it, but they should be afraid when it's being used indiscriminately because that is not LLMs are not a um, they're a probabilistic tool, and you
Mm.
don't. And actually, I just finished a really cool book called Why Machines Learn.
Why
It's about
machines
the
learn? Okay.
Yeah, and it's about the mathematics behind AI and how it kind of all evolved. So it's a bit heavy on the math side,
Okay.
but at the end, what they really say is that these LLM models are behaving in a way that we don't understand from a mathematical perspective. Like
Wow.
everything else along the way, we understood the mathematical foundations, and mathematical theory predicted what we're seeing in the real world. Mathematical theory is not predicting what we see in the real world with LLMs. So we kind of don't understand what's happening there.
Can we say, do they say then in the book that, well, that's okay, we can still rely on the outputs?
No, well, no, what they say, but what that means is that you
Yeah.
have to be really careful how you're using it, right? So
Mm,
that means that, look, if I'm going to go, if I want to throw a few papers into Notebook LM and ask it to give me a summary of that I'm going to review anyway, fine.
yeah.
You're going to look at it and be able to figure out as a subject matter expert whether this is good or bad or
Yeah.
whatever, right? But
Yeah.
if you're looking for something that requires accuracy like GXP activities, absolutely not. Right? In the sense that it says you're still going to have humans in the loop. And then what they're doing is actually real data verification. And then, well, what's the point of the LLM? You're constantly having to do data verification every
Mm,
time you do a synthesis of something, right? So what we're saying is well, use LLM, but use it to do a human reviewed conversion of unstructured data into our structured platform.
mm-hmm.
Because now you only have to do it once. And once you put it into the platform and it's been reviewed and approved as a electronic record, you don't have to review that data again,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so over time, you take all this unstructured data and you convert it into a highly structured, contextualized model that's been verified. And
Mm-hmm.
now you have this beautiful, clean data set to then really go use for other AI tools, to prediction tools and other things to utilize. So I think the point I'm trying to make is you just want to be careful how you use the tool,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're gonna if you're gonna go do some furniture building and you're gonna cut some wood, and I say, "Oh, here, Peter, why don't you use my chainsaw?"
Mm-hmm.
That's not a good idea. Chainsaw is not for fine carpentry, right? It's for
Yeah.
cutting limbs off of trees or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But I would say, "Oh, here's my jigsaw." Okay, that makes more sense. I'm going to use my jigsaw to cut some nice patterns or whatever, right? So that's kind of the analogy there. Is like the LLM is kind of a chainsaw that people are using or if you need to cut a tree, don't use a jigsaw,
Mm-hmm.
right? Right. So I think that's where you need to be afraid, is when the tool is not being used appropriately. Um, and people are starting to recognize that. LLMs generate a lot of slop in our regulated industry. That's bad, really bad, right?
Yeah.
If you're summarizing strategy documents about business plans or this or that, fine. But anything that's critical, and that EU Annex 22 says, hey, guess what? You can't use Gen AI tools in any kind of closed loop environment. There has to be a involved in the loop, and
Yeah.
that's not going to change anytime soon. So
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that because I just got a set of SOPs to review from a client, and I had to push back on ethically. I cannot review these documents. I could tell that they were generated by some
yeah,
kind of LLM, for some data governance project, and it's like, and so I'm like, I'm not going to review this. Like, this is, I would basically have to start from scratch. It's not, I don't, and I can't bill you for that many hours. Like, it's not
right,
works, right?
right,
But what, like, I was thinking about this, and I'm like, man, the problem is that these folks that are doing this, they're not taking the time to understand data governance and figure out what data quality is before they wrote these
right,
SOPs. So they're like that time that to develop yourself professionally, they never did it. So I'm worried. I'm like, what's going to happen to this? They're probably junior folks who put these together, right?
right,
And I'm thinking,
right,
man, you're not going to the library. I mean, library meaning,
right,
just you're not doing the research. You're not like enhancing your ability to understand what is data governance. You're just using an LLM to like you're not going
right,
to learn anything, right? And I
right.
fear for this in the future, like challenging the human mind and like learning. It's going. If we're not careful, we're going to lose that. We're going to lose a lot of this professional development that happens when you're a young person.
Well, it's already
Yeah.
happening in the sense that there was a paper that I saw it on LinkedIn. There was a randomized controlled clinical trial that came out where they were looking at cognitive function between people who use a lot of Chat GPT and people who don't. And you're already seeing diminishing sort of cognitive capabilities because people just, it's a muscle. Thinking is a
Yeah.
muscle, and if you don't use it, you start to lose it. Basically, is what the conclusion I think is of this. And you're right. I think taking the time to really understand what these things mean is important because that's where you still continue to add value to your organization.
Yeah.
And then you're using things to summarize stuff, that's fine, but you at least have the background to confirm that
Yeah.
this is correct or not correct. Otherwise, you're just like, sounds good, must be right. This thing did it. And then that's how all this slop is getting generated. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was my first experience with AI slop, like in a professional environment. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I had feared this day and it is now here.
It is here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to ask one final question. Um,
Sure.
so if you could just pick one thing, if you, so say you're a young professional or just anyone who maybe is thinking about their role in the next 5 years from now, right? If you could pick one concept, you mentioned digital twins, you've mentioned risk management, you've mentioned Q8, Q14. If you could pick one thing, it could be any, not necessarily of those choices to really, really become an expert in through reading and maybe attending lectures or whatever, what would it be?
The way I think about it is the way I think about it for my kids,
Yeah.
right? So, that I live in Dublin now
Yeah.
and Ireland for a little while. And one of the reasons we came here was to give them sort of an international school experience. And they are
Mhm.
in this school, which I think the style of teaching is amazing. And what makes it amazing is that they are constantly reinforcing what I would call synthesis thinking, right? And
Mhm.
what that means is they don't like my youngest daughter doesn't go to a math class and then an English class and then a social studies class and then a science class and then where you just learn a concept for a few days and then they ask you to memorize that concept and then they
Memorization.
test you on
Yeah.
the concept. Yeah, right. So what happens
ChatGPT is
instead
pretty
is
good at memorization.
yeah,
So
right, right. Right. So what they do instead is they say we have for the next 6 weeks, we have this unit of inquiry. And so, as an example, they started with natural disasters, right? And so the unit of inquiry was natural disasters. And then they said, okay, there's all these, they started exploring the different natural disasters. There's earthquakes and hurricanes and tsunamis and this and that, right? And then the class voted on which one they wanted to kind of work on first. So they started working on earthquakes. So they start talking about earthquakes, and then they bring in the science of, okay, tectonic plates. And this is what happens, right? And some of the physics behind it, right? And then they're and then they're talking about they're doing art around it. They did for one of the elements the 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 natural disasters then kind of morphed into climate change conversations. And so with the climate change side of it, they I remember she had to create an art piece that was an infographic, right? So she plotted the drought levels of some country or whatever, which looked kind of like mountains. And then she created an art piece around the mountains, and she had cows in the field, and they were releasing methane that was causing global warming, and
hmm.
and it was a fascinating way to like think about bringing all this information together. And that's what I mean by synthesis thinking, right?
Hmm.
You, they moved on to tsunamis and then they did an art, they all had to do an art piece, the Japanese, the wave, that famous art
Yeah.
piece, the wave. Well, so, they all did sketches of the wave art piece related to tsunamis, right? Because that's, kind of so to me, like that is how learning really happens. That's how deep learning happens, right? And
Yeah.
and the things that I've been most successful with when I'm trying to deal with complex topics is bringing information from different experiences that I've had from different industries that I've worked in to to help think about the problem in our industry in a different way,
Hmm.
right? And I think that is something that I would encourage the next generations to think about because they're not being taught that way a lot of times. They're being taught very topically and memorize this, learn the test, right? Memorize this, the test, right? And that's not synthesis thinking. But for what we all do in our industry, synthesis thinking is really, really important because of all the different dimensions that have to ultimately come together to make good quality product for the patient.
Yeah. Earlier you had mentioned like framing the problem statement. understanding criticality, and then almost like using a structured approach to solve a problem,
Problem.
right?
Yes.
Synthesis
Yes.
thinking.
Synthesis thinking. Yep. Yep.
Great. Well, Yash, it's been a pleasure as always
Yes.
speaking with you.
Well,
I'm sure I'll see
likewise.
you over in Dublin soon.
Yes. Let me know.
Yeah.
There's plenty of Guinness here. So
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And again, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I will obviously put this on the website for folks who weren't able to join us for this session. Really appreciate your insights on ICHQ8, which is I think I mentioned on LinkedIn or maybe on the web on the email blast, but is having sort of a renaissance, right?
yeah.
As regulators focus on this new QMM, we have the introduction of Objective 4 into the compliance program. I don't think I think folks on the line should really spend some time understand like read through Q8 a few times, understand really try to understand those concepts of the QTPP and all those other topics that we talked about. So, but
Let me
I
raise the
guess we do
hand.
have a hand up. Yeah, it looks like
Yeah,
Jack.
Yep.
hi. Yes,
Hi.
hi. Could you post on your website, Peter, the references you're referring to now? Like you said, you recommend, you suggest that we read some of these things, but
Okay.
just so, yeah, would it be possible to post some of these
Sure.
references? We can go to them. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Peter, if you have my, I'm happy to share. Remember when we all went to Egypt and
Yeah.
we did that seminar for the Egyptian Regulatory Authority? I
Yes.
still have my deck around ICHQ8 that
Oh,
I'm happy to send to you if you want to post that as well too.
okay.
That was a little bit more broken down into kind of layer by layer what's happening in Q8 and what the expectations are. So
Yeah, I
maybe
could
that'll
build a
be
little
helpful. Maybe that'll be
section.
helpful.
I
Yeah,
could build a little
yeah,
section on my website with some of the things that we've talked about on
yeah,
in our discussion, including some of those slides. I think that would be great.
yeah, yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. All right.
And if anybody on the call has any other questions, whatever they'd like to send me, feel free to do that. I'm happy to. I'm very passionate about this, as you can tell. I really feel like I want to make the industry do continuous improvement with the industry as well too, and so it's been fun to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, was that I dropped off for a second there. That was weird.
I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe it was me. Yeah, who
Okay.
knows?
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, and we see some feedback here in the chat comments. Thanks, Tracy. Good to good to hear from you. You have Ramsey, Marie, Monica. All thank you very much for your feedback. Really happy to have Yash on the line. So Yash, thanks again. And
Yeah, absolutely.
and
Thank
I'm sure
you.
we'll
Thank
be
you for the
over in
invitation.
Egypt again soon. Yeah.
Just not in July.
Yeah, it's a bit hot. All right. Take care,
All right.
everyone. Have an excellent weekend. It's been
Likewise.
fun.